I am based in Richmond, California. I'm a ceramic-based sculptor. I make a lot of sculptures and installations that deal with Asian American or Chinese American identity and thinking about how experiences of immigration, cultural hybridity, and the assimilation fit into our understanding of who is American. I work a lot with clay. You know, I've always just enjoyed the feel of it. I just enjoy working with the material. I find it to be very meditative and joyful. But I also think too, clay itself has a lot of different contradictions in it that I really love. I love that you really have to pay attention to clay because as a material, it's always moving, it's drying, it's shrinking. And then of course, when you put it in the kiln, it becomes ceramic, which is actually a totally different material. It's very permanent. So yeah, I think those contradictions keep me coming back to it. And I think for sure, more recently I've been thinking too that those contradictions sort of help me think through different contradictions I feel about being Asian American. Yeah, it's been really great here. I love, normally I work in a shed in my backyard. And I do have access to facilities through the different schools I teach at, but it definitely feels really different to have this very dedicated space and time to devote towards my making. The kiln here is really nice. It's a great size. It's also, I don't normally have access to that type of facility in my everyday practice either. I'm really grateful for that. I love being in this environment with all these different artists from different places with very, different approaches to their making. People are using very different materials here. I feel sometimes with ceramics, it can feel very insular, where it's just clay people only talking to clay people. What makes me excited about ceramics in this environment is that it sort of just is another material to make art with. And I really feel that here, amongst the video artists and the installation artists. It sort of just helps me, I think, expand my own practice. And everyone's really cool, so that helps. I feel a lot of my work starts off with looking at objects, everyday objects, but also thinking about cultural objects, I guess. And I think a lot of times when we think about cultural objects, we like to think about, what's in the museum, or a monument. This is what best represents us as a culture. For me, I'm always thinking about objects and how they might represent who we are in a truer sense. A disposable coffee cup is probably more representative of how we live our day-to-day lives than the Statue of Liberty, or a security fence, which I was making a lot of previously. That might represent more the government's feelings about immigration versus the Statue of Liberty. So yeah, I look at a lot of different objects. I look at a lot of different traditional Chinese objects as well. Visually, I'm really familiar with them, objects in my home, but also trying to think about, how these traditional objects are seen today and how that still influences how we think about culture. A lot of my practice actually started off with just going grocery shopping in the different Chinese supermarkets in the Bay Area. And then just sort of setting aside some of those fruits and slip casting them. Going to the one Chinese supermarket to get the Chinese produce, which wasn't available in the mainstream supermarket. And even though our neighborhood was predominantly Cuban immigrants, they also had their own Cuban supermarkets because the main supermarket didn't have the foods that they wanted to eat. So there's this interesting separation of foods and cultures, even though the reality was that we were all living together. So I started by make these casts of different fruits to sort of represent this idea of how culturally it was all mixed together. And I also thought too about how bananas and oranges and apples, we are so common in American diets, but in actuality, they were all foreign and not native to the United States. And so for me, that was an interesting way to think about different immigrant groups. My parents who, grew up eating bitter melon, durian or jackfruit, but that's still considered exotic, not part of the mainstream, which is, I feel a very Asian American situation. And then now I'm making large peach sculptures because originally peaches are this very traditional symbol in Chinese culture that represent longevity and prosperity. But I also like too that they represent, the state fruit of Georgia. They're this very Southern American fruit. Then there's also peach emojis. So I love this one symbol can have all these different lives. That kind of made me obsessed with this idea of a peach garden, and also thinking too to the immortal peach garden in Chinese mythology, and then also wanting to create this different garden space that was maybe more representative of my own experience of being a third culture kid or person.